was brought up in a little papakainga called Oparure. And my experiences growing up is sort of quite varied. I was fortunate enough to still have my great-grandmother around up until the age of 18, and that's who I was named after, Kahutoi. In turn, she was named after King Koroki's cloak, his kahutoi that he battled in the land wars, and he actually named her. So it's funny how I've ended up doing a lot of weaving, and my name actually is about a kahutoi, a cloak. My middle name is Mere, named after my great-grandmother, Te Rongo Pāmama Mere. So I'm named after both my great-grandmothers on my paternal and maternal side. My upbringing, I come from a family of, there were 14 children, and my parents, I had an older brother and sister that passed, so I never actually got to meet them. But we lived in our own homestead that we still have today, and the land in which it's on. So I think we're very fortunate in that we had our own home gardens, and our family unit, whilst there's a lot of children, we were never more than 6 in the home at one time. My father was a fencing contractor. He used to work in the railways at early days, and we always had gardens, large gardens. And of course, when there were celebrations or be it tangi at our marae, our koha to that would be the potatoes or meat. So we had a little farm as well, just a small place. And my father went away from days on end because he was the first fencing contractor. My mum and my grandmother, well, they're known for their weaving. In my upbringing, because weaving was done on a daily basis, I actually thought that every mother did weaving. Every mother, and I'm not just talking about Māori mothers. I just thought that was part of their duties. If they weren't making piu or dyeing muka like what I've got here for what I'm weaving, or doing orders for kete, whaariki, korowai, they're renowned for. They were, especially my mother, was either doing sewing or making cakes or all sorts of handcrafts. And my grandmother, of course, she did a lot of knitting and crocheting, as well as some very fine thread crocheting, but as well as the weaving. So that was my upbringing, and I went to a local school. It was only 2 classes of about probably 30 in each. That's now been changed to a kura kaupapa. So we have a kohanga reo, kura kaupapa, and a wharekura. The land that the school is on was gifted by my great Te Rongo Pāmama's sister, my great aunt, who never had any children. So the gift of giving that land for the school was so that it could become the native school. And it's gone full circle because it was a mainstream school like when I attended. Now it's gone back to a native school. And as I grew up, of course, with weaving all around me all the time, I was taught and observed at an early age, and taught when I showed interest. But my grandmother, both my my great grandmother, both my grandmothers, they had a lot to do with us as children in their lives. And their value systems were totally different to what I see today. I sort of bear witness, like my granny Kahutoi would never ever have her clothes washed in a washing machine. It had to be hand washed because she believed that the cleanliness from her body could only be cleaned with the hands that wore the clothes. And so she would never put her, it was just things like that. My grandmother, hurahanga, and I still do it today, when we cut our nails, to bury them. So there's certain things that we're brought up with, that, and the hair, never to cut hair at night. I never ever burn the hair. It always had to be buried. So those sorts of values. And cleanliness, hygiene, body hygiene, you had a towel for the body, a face cloth, a towel for the hands, a towel for the hair. And that's the way, we're a bit different. I don't go that far, but I tend to, especially when I have visitors, I always put a towel, a face cloth, a hand towel, and an extra towel just in case, because I think, well, maybe they have different. And usually they only use one. But I always make sure that I never assume that they don't use those practices. Dad, he was the hard worker, and but he was the person that encouraged us in a really different way. He would actually almost ridicule the work that you'd do, so that you'd work harder to get a better, well, no, I wouldn't say ridicule, but he'd just goad you. But really what he was doing was trying to make you do the best that you can. One thing about my father, he would say, you measure twice, and you'll never have to do it again. So he always made sure that we did things properly the first time. Always do it right the first time. And that sort of thing has stuck. And if you're unsure about anyone asking someone to do something for you and you're unsure, it's best to do it yourself. I have 2 other sisters that frequently weave. But my mum and grandmother never didn't push us to weave. If we were observers of it, we knew when to get out of the way, so to speak. It was just something that you did. We knew that the tikanga, and you don't step over the harakeke, you help with the gathering of the harakeke, you clean the harakeke, the pā harakeke. And another thing that I remember doing is collecting the pia harakeke, especially in the autumn months, because that's when the harakeke was rich with the gum. And that's what we used to use to bind feathers together as opposed to softened soap. The pia harakeke, of course, had very good medicinal properties. And I remember having an accident, scarring my knee when I was playing netball, and my mother rubbed the pia harakeke over it. What it did, it sealed it, and similar to a plaster, except it was like a second skin. And it doesn't leave any scar. So it just helps regenerate and rejuvenate the growth of your skin, and then it just peels off. I remember, collecting the pia harakeke, and then, as an observer, get to do chores. They'd let you. You wouldn't just push your way through. I remember as a child collecting all the bits of muka and then making something out of it myself. But always in the corner, not exposed to and out of their way, not exposed to anyone, just sort of by yourself and just trialing it out. And so whilst you were observing them, they were actually, in fact, observing you to see if you had an interest. Yeah, I think it was curiosity more than anything else for me. But I began to really enjoy working with muka. And I love I liked science and maths. So to me, that's all part of it. And in addition, well, in our way, in our Te Ao Māori way, that is our science and maths. Yeah. She told us about how she used to, first of all, the most important thing was to formulate relationships with the mother-to-be and the father, because it was, as a midwife of the area in Oparure, she was the midwife for many of the children that are, well, they're probably in their late 60s now. The reason for formulating those relationships and strong kinships is because although she was the midwife, she was the auntie, their grand-aunt as well in the end. But we often talked to her about that because it was quite intriguing to know that she had another different skill that wasn't practiced as we were children growing up, because they were all the children went all the mothers went in to give birth to their children in the hospital. But she used to talk about going to boiling water or using hot stones and form a little sort of trench, and the water would be splashed on it for steam, and the father would be there to miri the mother and during the birth, and the midwife would sit in front. The father would catch the baby, not the midwife. The first hands that the baby would fall into, depending on how good that father would be, because some would not want to be part of it, but they'd still have to be. They'd have to prepare the fire for the heating of the stones to create the steam. And the steam was to, the mother would have to not be on a bed, certainly it would be crouched over, and the steam would rise to help with the cleaning out, especially after the afterbirth had come away. And there'd be always, water there to clean the mother after. The father would be there to miri to go through all of the, while she was in labour, and the midwife would be there too. When the child was born, she talked about I talked about pia harakeke. So when the child was born, they'd have a little container of pia harakeke, and they'd rub it around the pito, and then they'd tie the umbilical cord with the muka, a very thin piece of muka, because it's so strong, and they'd tie it, it'd almost cut it. And so they'd tie it close to the pito, and then the father would tie another piece, and in the middle it would be severed with obsidian, but the obsidian would be heated over on the stone, and just the slither, so that it would be absolutely clean, and the pia harakeke would heal, start healing almost instantaneously, and then the baby wasn't fully washed, she said, unless there was a lot of blood, but they tended to leave the baby unwashed for a little while, and until the baby started to suckle and things like that. Yeah. So she said the conventional methods that were used, I remember her saying, by mothers giving birth and baby, it's just so unnatural the way mothers have to give birth today. She said it's and there's no dignity in it. And that was the other thing about the birthing. There was always dignity. The mother with the child, the mother was covered all the time. And there would be, I remember her asking her, was there a certain karakia performed? And she said, well, it really depended on the parents, whether they wanted that to happen. If there was a tohunga there, certainly, yeah. But she said that sometimes you'd be so busy make sure that the mother is comfortable. That was the most important thing, to mentally prepare the father and mother for this birthing, so that there wasn't too much stress on the baby. Nana was very much a perfectionist, and so the way we were brought up, we had to make sure that things were put in place. And whilst we tended to be lazy to have order in our lives, she was truly the matriarch to make sure that happened. That you dare not go and stay with my grandmother and expect that you can have breakfast at 10:30. Breakfast was early in the morning, and she was very methodical. With her weaving, she's methodical, so she was methodical in her life, and then our lives had to become methodical to work in with them and my mum. And there were so many of us, so we all had our duties. We, right down to silvering the cutlery and brassing the doorknobs and polishing the floors, something that kids wouldn't be, just wonder what are you talking about? But so preparing meals, we all had to help. I do remember sitting around a fire at home, and my grandmother would talk about what we contributed to the family for the day. Like she'd say, well, we wouldn't be sitting here around this warm fire, toasty fire. And she'd say to my brother, if you hadn't started the fire early this morning. And just to make him feel really important. Mm-hmm. Or she'd say to me, we wouldn't be sitting in warm clothes if you hadn't washed them and dried them and brought them in. And then say to my other sister, well, our stomachs are full because you did peel the potatoes. You contributed. So she always talked about contributing, how we all contribute to the whānau. And that was just something she used to do occasionally. And I think because of fashion was a great thing of theirs too. My grandmother and my mother. And they could walk between two worlds. Yeah. She, it was quite unusual. And then my grandmother, my dad's mum, we used to go and visit her at the marae, and she stayed there. So we had our grandmother that lived on the marae, and we had a grandmother that lived in town. So we had sort of a town nanny and the marae nanny. They had their favourite harakeke cultivars, varieties for the muka, for whāreki, for piu-piu. And we, as children, you learnt, well, I did. I can't say that for some of the others, but, I learnt the names off by heart, and I learnt the characteristics of what they looked like. But, I do remember my nanny on Dad's side, because she used to weave as well. She talked about the harakeke being, our relationship with the harakeke as a whānau. She would talk about it in a very holistic way. Whereas opposed to my mum and my grandmother, well, they used it as for function. And my grandmother, Nana Huranga, used to talk about it as a very spiritual plant. So she talked about all the healing properties in it, and not only what you could use it to make things with. And so the connection between the pā harakeke and us was just ongoing all the time. So that was our whakapapa to the harakeke as well. She would talk to us about, because, knowing that mum and my Nana Hetan worked with harakeke all the time, my Nana Huranga would talk to us about the connection we have with the harakeke and why that is, and how it will continue on in our lives. And she was right. And when I think about it now, I'm so glad that I continued to be interested in it as a child, and then growing up and realising how important it is for us. But that's my own opinion with it. Harakeke is always part of my life. When people talk about harakeke or flax, as they say it, I even have this thing about, well, actually it's not flax, it's harakeke. I really do have a strong opinion about that, because to me harakeke is harakeke. And why? Because it has its own whakapapa relationship, and then that whakapapa relationship to me is to the harakeke, not just to flax, and that's the difference. I've got a very strong view of it. So it is very important. Also, for a number of things, because of the memories, because of what I've learnt from it, because of the properties that it contains, because of everything that I do around harakeke is centred around that knowledge systems and value. Growing up as a child, when you go to harvest harakeke or take care of it with your parents, you get the jobs of taking the pukaha away, the rotten leaves and things like that, and put in a separate pile, separated. And my grandmother and mum used to do this all the time. They used to actually take all those discarded areas away and put it into a totally different pile, so that it frees the harakeke plant to rejuvenate quicker, and simply because they were using it all the time. Now that is the relationship that we've had with it, because they were using it all the time, and we'd always make sure when you look at the harakeke, pā harakeke from a distance, and it's starting to become a mass, you realise it's something. It's just like your hair. when your hair grows and it's time for a haircut. Well, it's the same with the harakeke. And so we'd always have to trim it back. And in the end, offer to go and get the harakeke for mum and nana. But that would only happen if after you knew what you were doing, like the way in which it's cut, when to cut it, to take note of the seasons, to clear around it, to identify what type of harakeke for whatever function it was, the harakeke for the piupiu, the harakeke for the muka work, for the korowai, the harakeke for whāriki or for ki te whakairo. There was a different harakeke, and we'd know which ones to get. And that's the same with going out and with the dyes. The busyness in our family, it was the norm. And so it would be passed down in a different way, I guess you would say. My parents, my grandparents, of course, they were hard workers, and time was always of the essence for some reason. We always had to be doing something. When television came in, that was introduced, and I never forget my younger brother being absolutely mesmerised by television, to the point that he was oblivious to anything else going around. He was just fixated with that. And to my parents, much to my parents' and grandparents' disgust, they couldn't believe how a child could just get so almost hypnotised. That's how they by a television. So the values of keeping busy and contributing to the family, it was very important as it was passed down through the generations. But of course it didn't take long, when the influences of things being made easier all the time as we grow older, remote control, this, that, microwaves, all of that, and everything so easily accessible. The values of, and I've noticed in the mokopuna and in the mokopuna tuarua, the great grandchildren, are totally different. Some of them wouldn't even know how to grow a garden, and that's quite sad, really, when we have our own papakainga and they prefer to go and buy their groceries like anyone else at a grocery store, never would give it one thought to grow their own. It's been an amazing journey for me watching them. It's been quite humbling. I've taught them the skills I know, of course, that's been passed down, but they come with extra skills of their own. And the harakeke, and it's not just harakeke, there's kia and pinga, and a lot of students I've taught, they just appreciate being able to manipulate the harakeke or the kia pinga for function and form, to make something and to be proud of it. In any little thing that they could, you have certain ones that are really hungry to learn more, and some are just on the course because they had to take the course. But what's come out is that they've realised, I like to teach them so that they can understand their relationship with the harakeke. So that it just doesn't become a material. It has function and form, it has a life, and has a connection to you and how you work with it. It has its own mana. That's and whakapapa, of course. And harakeke for them well, you know, when I hear them talk about flax, or Nanny did a lot of flax stuff, that's, you know, that type of conversation, it's quite sad. But then when they see a cloak, and we've been spoilt with choice because there's so many cloaks, and they've all seen them, but to process that through, they wouldn't have a clue.
Of how they're made.
Of how they're made.
Yeah.
I think they have, some of them, the mukapunas have an idea, but the great-grandchildren, I don't. No. Well, there's a few, you know, like huche te rito te harakeke. Kei he, it's a koimaka o e koi. Yes, that's one of the whakataukī, but also kia hora timberino, kia papapauna me te moana, kia tere tere ka rohi rohi. That's one that's often used in our family. But because we're such a large family, it was about being making sure that the calm is spread amongst us all. And how to do that, how to value each other. And that's what I find is not happening today. And when I think back to my grandmother, you know, even when she was doing midwifery, how she built up a relationship. It's like how she made us build up a relationship with harakeke. You know, I can only really speak for myself. I don't know how my other brothers and sisters feel about that, but they know the importance of harakeke. So it's a reciprocation between ourselves and the materials that we use, the whenua in which it's come from, and how it's all nurtured. So it all becomes one big part, the whole holistic whakapapa within the whānau. The harakeke, our whānau, our papakainga in which we've had, you know, since it's been passed down through the generation. But in terms of child rearing, the values about the whakapapa relationships and it doesn't necessarily, I mean, I just gave you an example about us with harakeke, but with the respect with the adults. And because we have, today we have such a mixture of the types of families. You know, we have a lot of solo mothers. We have same-sex couples with children. We have children that are now being brought up by their grandparents because for whatever reason, the parents cannot. We have working class mothers and fathers where the child is reared by someone totally different. So in this space and time, it's really hard to compare. It's best to compare apples with apples and try and look at what's happening today. And what I mean by that is it's hard to identify in this space and time what we could use that what our grandparents were brought up with.
It's a different time.
It's a different time. However, you know, like they say, you always have to look back. And that's another, you know, you always have to look back to go forward, and that was something that always stuck in my mind. My grandmother always used to say, idle hands, idle mind. And so we always kept busy. But having said that, that's quite indicative of my life nowadays. I'm doing, you know, if I'm doing 2 or 3 things on the go all the time. And life's too short. She's going, you know, you sleep for the rest of your life. When you're dead, you'll sleep on forever. But while you've got life, use the time. So that sort of thing used to play on your mind, never to waste time. Yet I could easily cuddle up in my blanket and read a book on a rainy day and just rest. And sometimes your body tells you so. So those are the sort of things that I think we need to replenish a different value system, and by meaning bringing out more respect for each other and learning to trust. There's not a lot of trust. And it's quite sad that there's no trust nowadays. Yeah. Because a lot of things that we do, even when we have interviews, everything's about trust. Signing forms and, yeah. So I guess it depends on the parents in child rearing, on how they want to bring their children up and what sort of values that they value. But I also think that there is one regret I know that my mum had. Not so much my dad, but wasn't that they never taught us the language at an early age. I asked her why, and my mother said that she they're always told that, oh no, your children need to learn the English properly. I don't need to worry about Māori. My father had a bad time at school because he spoke Māori. So now it's great to see the language being revived. And I feel that if you only know one language, you only know one world. And I think within the language, Māori language especially, you learn different tikanga associated with that language. And I think with what we're doing, we in a round or indirect way, we're learning the tikanga of a descriptive live language through the weaving. If I can say it like that. So the practice brings life to the language, and then the language brings life to the practice. That's how I think of it.